Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's special guest is Amanda Ann Gregory, a trauma psychotherapist. Today she speaks with me about forgiveness, trauma, mind-body connection, racial justice, gender justice, and her new book, You Don't Need to Forgive. Please stay tuned. Please join me and Dr. Tripp Fuller for Homebrew Christianity's 4-week online class, Rediscovering the Spirit, Hand-Raisers, Han, and the Holy Ghost. This course will explore the dynamic, often overlooked third person of the Trinity. Course will cover the Spirit in Scripture and early Christianity, historical developments and theological tensions, feminist and global perspectives on the Spirit, and living in the Spirit today. Please go to www.homebrewchristianity.com and register today. Please join Tripp Fuller and me at Holy Trinity Lutheran, Chapel Hill Church for our live Homebrew Christianity podcast and book signing on June 8th at 7 p.m. This is free and open to the public. Please meet us there. Colonized and appropriated by capitalism, dominant culture, fitness trends, and body shaming, yoga in America is associated with expensive classes, trendy athleisure products, core power, Lululemon, and white women. However, yoga is not a 1-hour fitness class aimed at stretching and flexibility. Yoga is a spiritual practice from South Asia with the ultimate goal of connection, self-realization, and liberation. In Liberating Yoga, a new book from Broadleaf Books, yoga teacher Harpinder Kaur Mann draws from her own perspective as a Sikh Punjabi woman who was alienated by the way yoga is practiced in the United States, but found her way toward reclaiming the spiritual practice for herself. Mann demonstrates that moving away from appropriated forms of yoga and back to yoga roots is the true path to healing, both for yoga practitioners who desire to engage responsibly in the practice with cultural appreciation, and especially for folks who have been marginalized, who wish to reconnect with their ancestral spiritual practices and reclaim their full identity. Please read Liberating Yoga.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast@gmail.com. This is Madang, an outdoor living room for guests to share their experiences and their work. I invite you to come in and stay for a while.
Welcome to Madang Podcast. Today's special guest is Amanda Ann Gregory, who is a trauma therapist renowned for her work in complex trauma recovery, notably as the author of You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. With a keen focus on specific needs of trauma survivors, Gregory's expertise spans over 20 years in clinical practice. She has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, and Newsweek, and published in Writer's Digest, Psychotherapy Networker, Counseling Today, and Psychology Today. She's with us today to talk about her book, You Don't Need to Forgive. Dr. Ariel Swartz writes, profound, compassionate, and empowering. You Don't Need to Forgive is a vital source for anyone navigating the complexities of trauma recovery. Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on Madang Podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a joy, and I just love your book. It's such an important book. It's kind of out of my kind of area of comfort, but it was really enlightening. So thank you so much for writing it and for coming on Madang today to talk about it.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so before we go right into your book, I know you're practicing as a psychotherapist in Chicago. So if you want to say something about your work and kind of your day-to-day life in Chicago, that'll be fun.
I love trauma, and I know that's so strange to hear, But it is true. This is something that I started fresh out of grad school as a young clinician, and I fell into it accidentally, and I
Oh,
never got out of it because I
oh,
didn't want to. And I love complex trauma, which is developmental trauma, usually childhood trauma, trauma that has compounded upon itself. It can be very difficult to treat, but I always see that as quite a challenge to go after. And so, in Chicago, I really spend my time as a clinician. We're treating those who are addressing their complex trauma. And, I do that, 4 days out of the week. And then the rest of the time, I'll be writing or presenting or training. And honestly, I'm still trying to find that balance of how much time do I want to devote to the clinical practice and how much to things like research and writing. And right now, I would say it's about 90% clinical and
okay.
10% the other. But I think as I got older, it might balance out a little bit, but it's going to take a lot for me to leave the clinical field. I get so much out of it.
Oh, that's so good. Well, you look so young. I don't know. Oh, you look so young to me. So it's amazing that you're doing both the clinical and the research and the writing. I think, as I look back, those who do really well, you're able to balance the two. It's hard to do, but those who can balance it because it feeds off each other. So, and I felt it even in your book. So this is a fantastic book, but from Broadleaf Books. I've written several books with them, and it's called You Don't Need to Forgive. So right from the beginning, it was, wow, you're just sharing some of your own pain and suffering. And I thought, this is really difficult to um, write, let alone like share it with the whole world. So tell me how you began kind of the journey of wanting to write this particular book.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that I had done a ton of work in trauma recovery before I even came to this book. And that's so important because if I hadn't have done that, I don't think I could have written it at all.
Uh-huh.
But I was really at that space and I had gone through struggling with forgiveness, the concept of that in my own recovery. And I kept seeing that in the work with my clients, trauma survivors as well. And so with that pairing, it was always something that I kept coming back to and questioning, forgiveness and questioning. And I could never get an answer of do trauma survivors need to forgive to make progress in trauma recovery? I could never get a straight answer. And it kind of got to the point where I wrote a little bit about it for blogs, just here and there about forgiveness. And I got a huge wave of responses. Some people who were very much against it, some people who were for it, some people who didn't know and wanted more information. And so that kind of gave me the evidence to say, okay, wait a minute, what's going on here? Somebody had to have written about this from this point of view. And I found out nobody has.
Uh-huh.
And then I realized, oh no, that is a huge sort of gap in
Uh-huh.
the literature there. And it was actually my partner that said to me one day, this is a book, right? You know
Okay.
that. You can see. I was like, well, I don't, but thank you for telling me that because now I have to write a book. But that's kind of how I got into it to make this a bit easier for others, for other therapists, for other trauma survivors to really answer that question. Do you need to forgive? And, spoiler alert, because the title of the book is, well, you don't. You, forgiveness is elective. So for those who don't have time to read the book, I just saved you a lot of time. You don't have to. But that's kind of how I got into it. It was quite a journey, years and years of research and writing. This was not something that I wrote quickly because I had to bring in the research and the case studies and then all the things along with it.
Well, you began with your story, so I thought it was going to be more reflective, but it is very well researched and so well written. So thank you for writing about this, especially as Christians, we're kind of told to forgive. But before we get into that, and you got to like the point of the book, but I wanted to say, you begin by sharing your suffering. So I don't know how you were able to share that. And I'm really grateful because it really draws the reader in, and I'm sure there are many people who have experienced similar difficulties or traumas. So how did you have so much courage? So how were you able to kind of share that right from the beginning of the book?
I thought it was necessary.
Okay.
You know, I read these other books written by clinicians, and very few of them do share their
Yeah,
trauma
that's true.
narratives or their
Yeah.
story. When they do, it's just very little, and you're like, I want some more. I want to know that you understand me.
Uh-huh.
But honestly, I give a lot of credit to the generation of therapists that are behind me. Because I feel like they are really leading this movement of appropriate and safe self disclosure in therapy from the therapist or the clinicians. And we're seeing more of that come out in writing with other clinicians sharing their story. And when I was going to grad school, I kind of feel like I was the transitional generation in the mix,
Oh,
where you still had some of those outdated messages of you never tell your clients anything about you,
yeah.
nothing. You are a robot, you are a machine.
Uh-huh.
And the generation behind me is very much against that. They're like, no, as long as it's ethical and safe, we're going to self disclose. We see that it's making a positive difference. So I was kind of like in between. And I do
Oh,
very much go on the side of appropriate self disclosure because, especially in trauma treatment, you
uh-huh.
need that connection, you need that safety, you need that relationship with the person, and they need to see who you genuinely are. Because one thing that I absolutely love about trauma survivors
Uh-huh.
is they can sense a fake person a mile away.
Oh,
They can instinctually sense it. It is a gift.
oh,
Um, and
wow.
in that,
Uh-huh.
as a clinician, you need to be real. You need to be genuine. Now, you don't make it about you ever, but
Uh-huh.
you do need to bring to the table into the therapeutic space what you were. So when I was writing the book, I said, I got to stay true to that. I need to do that, or else I'm just this therapist that did this research and decided to write this book. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Uh-huh.
But I wrote this book because I struggled with the same thing. And that matters. And I think when clinicians are vulnerable, when we say, you know what, I've experienced trauma, I had to go to recovery, I'm still going through recovery because it's a constant lifelong process. I think that gives other people the permission, to go through that as well.
Oh, okay. Well, I was really grateful that you shared it right at the beginning because it really drew me in. I just felt the pain, and you know, I remember teaching students too that, you don't expose yourself. But I think your vulnerability was like a gift to the reader. And I'm just so grateful for that. So thank you so much for sharing it. And, you do write that I was a victim of physical and emotional childhood neglect. And you wrote to survive, I learned to disappear just like my parents. So if you want to say a little bit about that, of how people disappear and like what does that mean, clinically, etc., you can share whatever with that on that topic because I found it was very helpful for me.
Yes. And when I talk about the disappearing,
Yeah.
clinically, I'm really talking about disassociation. That feeling of being emotionally disconnected from people, from yourself, from the environment. As a kid, I would engage in what's sort of being called now um, maladaptive daydreaming, which is a type where you are in other worlds with other peoples. And, kids, of course, and adults daydream, absolutely. But it was very extensive.
Uh-huh.
And it was something that my little brain used to survive. And, as I look back, I see signs that my parents did it as well. So I think this is something also that I kind of picked up on as well. And, in that disappearing act, something that helped me keep myself safe, the issue with that is that it also closed me off to other opportunities of
Oh,
relationships with people to develop. And I had to do that to stay safe. And part of my recovery was really, how do I come out of that? Then how, now that I am safe and I am around safe, capable people, how
uh-huh.
do I come out and then reconnect? And that was very difficult to learn. And honestly, I'm still learning it from time, because my default setting, and I think it'll always be this way,
Uh-huh.
is to disconnect, is to draw back. And sometimes that's appropriate, but sometimes not so much. I think it's all about a balance.
Well, that might be your next book then. If you,
Yeah.
I think that's an important topic too. So the entire book is about forgiveness, and but I was quite fascinated when you kind of tell right at the beginning that or you raise the question, can forgiveness be harmful? I've never, as a Christian theologian, I've written a few pieces on forgiveness, and in my books, I have maybe a chapter on forgiveness. I've never written a whole book on forgiveness, but I've never come across this question. Even in my own writing and reflecting, can forgiveness be harmful? And you raise it near the beginning of the book. So tell us uh, what you mean by the question, can forgiveness be harmful?
Yes. Forgiveness is often seen in society and even in psychology at times as being a panacea. It's always good. It's never bad. And even at times, people saying it's going to help everybody, no
Yeah.
matter what.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I mean, as we know, there is no panacea. If it was, we would be out of work. We would just give it to everybody and then we walk away. Now you're fine. But with that and looking at forgiveness, it being seen in this gold standard, of morality and well-being, to even question it and even say, could it be harmful, is like saying, can empathy be harmful? Can gratitude be harmful?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, anything can be harmful. It depends on how it's spun, how it's utilized, when it comes into play, all those things. But forgiveness can. And I did find that out. Not something I wanted to find out, but
Mhm.
I did. And I had to accept that. And when we look at forgiveness being harmful, there's so many ways that it can. Forgiveness, especially forced forgiveness or pressured forgiveness or forgiveness that is encouraged at times, even encouraged, could actually sabotage genuine forgiveness from happening.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes when we do that, when we force forgiveness, we don't realize, but we can be jeopardizing someone's feelings of safety and agency, which is vital in trauma recovery. And honestly, in my opinion, any therapeutic work that you're doing, forgiveness can unfortunately promote shame. It can, especially if we're told you need to forgive and we can't forgive. Well, that can lead to, well, I've done something wrong. I'm a failure because I can't forgive. Forgiveness can also hinder unrestricted emotional processing by restricting it. Sometimes when we push forgiveness, the message is, well, you can be angry, but only for a period of time, right? But you need to let that go because you
Uh-huh.
need to
Yeah.
forgive.
Uh-huh. I
And
hear that all the time.
that can be harmful. It absolutely could. And, if we look at forgiveness too, we do need to realize that people who are a part of marginalized populations, women, people are Black, brown, these folks tend to be pressured or encouraged to forgive more than others. And that has caused harm because sometimes it is used to sort of keep the sort of the hierarchy systematic issues in place, unfortunately.
Wow. So thank you so much for clarifying that. The big word these days is trauma. So, people throw it around and it's unclear what everybody is saying about trauma. So you in your book you dig deeply and you go into the ancient Greek word. So tell us what you mean by trauma, or what is um, psychotherapists or therapists referring to when we're using the word trauma, because people do kind of throw it around. And so, yeah, tell us.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because it has become sort of a pop
Yeah.
psychology, type
Mhm.
of word. And I always tell people to, just lean into that with some empathy, to know that I think there is a reason why this is happening. Sometimes when people have felt that they haven't been heard, that no one's acknowledging their distress, they do look for words that say, I'm going to make sure
Uh-huh.
what that's like for me and how that feels.
Uh-huh.
But trauma is so much different than just distress or something that happened, it's stuck with me. Trauma is about the wound. It's about dysregulation. It's about the nervous system changes, the brain changes. It's something that sticks around for a period of time. trauma is never about the event or the experience. Trauma is not a diagnosis. So trauma actually extends beyond diagnosing. And so when we look at trauma, we're looking at a response to something. It doesn't matter what the event was or what the experience was. It's the response, it's the wound. How long is this hung around? How is this impacting the person? It's usually quite significantly in very, very deep ways. It impacts someone. So when someone's defining trauma, the things I tell them, especially with clinicians, is don't get wrapped up in the experience or the event because you're going to get lost because you're going to think one thing's traumatic and another's not. Really look at the impact that had on the person overall.
Wow. Okay. So, as you're talking about trauma in the book, you also connect about the impact it has on the body. So, this mind-body connection, and I really appreciated it because I'm always against this kind of Greco-Roman understanding of dualism, which has impacted Christianity and much of our world thinking. But here you're talking about this mind-body connection, which is fundamental and powerful. So as everything that impacts your mind also impacts the body. Before we had this very clear distinction between mind and body or soul and body. So within theological understanding, the soul is out there and the body is here. But here you make this kind of connection, and I thought it was so powerful. So tell us a bit more about this mind-body connection.
Yes. And so one thing I love, about this connection, especially in trauma work, is I am not chained to the prefrontal cortex or, that part of the brain that's in charge of logic, reasoning, thinking things through. You're just not tied to that. And sometimes, frankly, you don't need it in this work, which is wonderful. I had a client this morning, actually. We were working through something, we were doing some EMDR, and they had a physical response in their body. And it stopped them. And they said, well, I don't know what that is. I don't know where they came from. And my response was, you don't need to know. We don't need to know. Let's just sit with it. Let's see what that wants to do. And the sensation started in her stomach. And it was very deep. And this is something she's felt since a child. It's very old. And then it started to rise and she was just following it. Then it was in her chest and it felt very heavy in her chest. And then it went to her throat and it felt like she had like a lump in her throat that she couldn't get out. And then all of a sudden it went up through her jaw and it was gone.
Wow.
That may never come back, that sensation. I suspect I know where it came from. I never need to know, and neither does she. And so when we're doing this work, sometimes we will notice sensations that are the result, of trauma, and you can't think your way through them. You can't say, oh, I feel that in my stomach. I'm going to find out where that came from. And I'm going to talk myself out of having that response and this and that. And I'm going to do that coping mechanism. That doesn't always work. So when we're looking at that mind body connection, a lot of what I do is actually kind of based in the body and not, relying on that insight. And I know that's tough. That's tough for a lot of people. That was tough for me in recovery because I'd gotten so used to the idea that if I can rely on insight, if I can get all the answers, I'm going to be good. But it takes more than that. It takes the body work as well.
Wow. So, that's all interesting to me. And then you just shared a little bit about the trauma. What was fascinating in your book is that you said trauma cannot be cured. I always thought that trauma is something, you experience it and then you can be cured. But you're basically saying it cannot be cured. So to listeners, please share why trauma cannot be cured.
Yes. And when you read the book, you know that I'm very much against all or nothing sort of parameters, because when we talk about people and our brains, and it just doesn't work very well. It just doesn't. So heal to me means we're done. We're over it, right? It no longer has any impact on me going forward. I don't think that's possible with trauma because it's going to impact you. It's already changed you. The change is already done. But trauma can be processed, it can be moved around, it can be integrated, which means our brain, our body holds on to what it needs and lets go of the rest. And this is so healthy. And this is something, just so you know, I got from Dr. Judith Herman. So I did not come up with that at all. She has a wonderful saying. She's a trauma researcher. She says, trauma therapy is not exorcism. We're not exorcising demons from you, and I can just imagine her voice saying that. So it's more about that integration. And so if we're not relying on this 100% healed, I'm 100% healed, I'm no longer impacted by that. Believe in that. I think we are forever changed, and sometimes we're changed for the best. There are some trauma survivors that I've worked with that will tell you that they have no lack of confidence in their strength and their ability to navigate the world. None. They know they can protect themselves. They have wonderful self-worth. And we have to look at that. Where does that come from? That could have come from trauma. Maybe they had that all along. We don't know. But I think trauma does forever change you. But it doesn't need to change you in a way that is always going to keep you stuck or always hold you back.
Wow. Okay, so thank you for that. As you're, citing doctors, this book is really well researched, so I highly recommend it to anyone interested in trauma and forgiveness. So before you get into what forgiveness is, in the book you talked about what forgiveness is not, which I found so helpful. I think this was the most helpful thing because I think we get it mixed up. And I kind of took notes, and I think you came up with, 12 ways of what forgiveness is not. Just to name a few: impersonal, forgetting, uh, rationalizing, excusing, justifying, condoning, and the list goes on. And I found this so helpful because I think some of us think this is what forgiveness is. So share a few of these, what forgiveness is not, that many people think, even like myself, think it is. If you can just share a few of them.
Yes. The biggest ones that I come across is that forgiveness is not reconciliation.
Okay.
So we can completely forgive someone and never speak to them again, never have any contact because it's not the same. Now, sometimes forgiveness can lead to reconciliation, but
Yeah.
sometimes we can reconcile without forgiving. We may reconcile, but have very firm boundaries with someone to keep ourselves safe. This is a really tough concept for folks, especially when we get into the realm of family estrangement and things like that. People will say, no, if you're going to forgive, you reconcile, but they're not. We have to separate those apart, because if we don't, then we get into the realm of people again being harmed by this forgiveness, because people are saying you need to reconcile with this person. You need to forgive them, but they're not the same. One that also comes up in the world of trauma is forgiveness is not a trauma response. So forgiveness isn't something I do to keep myself safe. No, it's not that. In fact, I need to feel safe before I forgive. So forgiveness isn't people pleasing. It's not giving in. That's not genuine forgiveness. So again, we've got to separate those. And another one is forgiveness isn't a shortcut or a way to bypass emotional processing. So forgiveness isn't going to rescue me from my anger. I have to connect with my anger. I have to feel it in a way that I feel safe, so that anger could actually process and integrate. And maybe that opens up to where then I can forgive. But forgiveness isn't a shortcut.
Well, one of them that kind of stood out was when you wrote about acceptance, and then you quoted Oprah Winfrey, where she says, forgiveness as giving up hope that the past could be any different. So if you can say a little bit about acceptance, because many people, and I appreciated the reconciliation because that's always like everybody thinks that's what forgiveness is, and it has to go hand in hand. It's, reconciliation leads to forgiveness, forgiveness leads to reconciliation. So say a little bit about acceptance.
I love acceptance. I love acceptance and trauma recovery and grieving. It's great. And acceptance is, first of all, I tell everybody acceptance isn't you agree. Acceptance isn't you like it. No, it's none of that at all. Because if we're looking at grieving, that would be, oh, I'm so glad this person passed away. No, you never have to get there. Acceptance is this cognitive and emotional state of it is what it is. It is. I can't change it. And a lot of times when we experience acceptance, we have a significant decrease in sort of our emotional reactivity to what that was, right? So we may have less sadness, less anger, things like that. Forgiveness and acceptance are separate. Now, forgiveness can be a form of acceptance, absolutely, but forgiveness actually goes a step further than just I've accepted it. So forgiveness requires a little bit more, such as, I feel differently towards this specific person. Maybe I have empathy for them. Maybe I like them. Maybe I love them, depending on how you're defining forgiveness. But acceptance, I think acceptance can be a bit easier than forgiveness because you don't have to have all those positive feelings towards it. Because there are plenty of trauma survivors that experience acceptance. They will sit there, look you in the eye and be like, this happened when I was a kid, this, and that. And I know it happened. I know I can't change it. I know it impacted me. I'm feeling much better about it. I don't like it, but I can sit here and tell you the story of it and not really have a ton of emotions about it. That's acceptance.
Well, so you did all this. It's a long list of what forgiveness is not. So please tell us what forgiveness is. What is it about?
This is so hard. This is not an easy thing to answer. There's literally a whole chapter about this because we don't agree. We don't.
Yeah.
And this is one of the flaws.
A bunch of people, that don't agree.
This is the flaws in the research, is we're not on the same page. And so one researcher defines forgiveness one way, the other another way, the other another way. And we just can't, especially in the field of psychology, we just can't get on the same page of what it is. We typically agree on what it's not more than what it is. So I'll tell you a little bit about where we disagree and then where I stand, if that helps.
Yeah.
So there is a disagreement about, is forgiveness a choice or not? Some people will say, absolutely, you need to make a cognitive decision to forgive. And if you don't, then you're not going to forgive. And if you think you've forgiven and you haven't decided to forgive, you didn't forgive. I don't believe that. I don't believe it's this cognitive choice. I do believe there needs to be a certain level of openness to it. Because if we're closed off to forgiveness, I do believe that would sabotage forgiveness, if that's an experience that would benefit us. But instead of this cognitive decision, I just think there needs to be a level of receptiveness to it. So forgiveness is a level of receptiveness to even going through the process. Because I've had clients that experienced forgiveness organically when there was no decision, there was no goal of forgiveness, there might have never been any discussion, and then they forgive. So is that not forgiveness? I think it still is. Forgiveness is not a destination so much. It's more of the process.
Oh, yeah.
So forgiveness is something you go through, right? Kind of like grief. And there could be moments of forgiveness, moments of increased forgiveness. I look at forgiveness on more of a spectrum, and this is, again, where people disagree. So where do we end up on that spectrum? Where are we going? So on one side of sort of this continuum could be revenge, anger, right? Resentment. And on the other end is complete love, complete unconditional love. Where am I at regarding that person? And wherever I fall at one period of time, some people will say that's forgiveness. Some people won't. So some people will say, if you don't love your offender, you have not forgiven. I disagree. Some people will say, if you don't like your offender, you haven't forgiven. I disagree. Some people will say, if you don't feel empathy for your offender, you haven't forgiven. Again, I disagree. I think if you get into the category of even apathy, I feel like that's forgiveness. I feel like that's great. If you go above that, wonderful. But one of the things I wanted to do is actually embrace forgiveness in a way that's much more trauma informed, because to say this person harmed you, they created and or contributed to your trauma. Now you need to love them. And if you don't love them, you haven't forgiven them. And if you haven't forgiven them, you're not going to make progress and you're a failure. That feels horrible to me. And so to me, that takes forgiveness off the table for trauma survivors. So if I were to define forgiveness, and I even came up with a working definition that I won't quote, but forgiveness is a process. It's a level of receptiveness to experiencing this process. I do believe it is unconditional as opposed to conditional, because forgiveness is a process that we do on our own. I don't believe the offender needs to be involved. Now, that doesn't mean we may not need boundaries. We may need estrangement. Absolutely, we have to consider that. But when we're looking at the process of it, that is ours. We don't necessarily need to involve the other person. Forgiveness is on a continuum where we can move about a little bit. Maybe we're not at the same space all the time, sort of like in the grieving process. So that's kind of how I define it, if that makes sense. I know that's
Oh, it
complex.
does. I love that it's this process because that's really helpful for many of us. We just think it's like one little thing, but it is a process. And in the book, you do lay it out so well. So I thought that was a very helpful section. And you also write that forgiveness is not a requirement to recover from trauma. Many people feel that it is, and you use the word elective, which was, I found it very helpful. And then, because you used it several times, and how in the US education system things, some courses are elective. So you kind of expanded and shared with that. So tell us why it's not a requirement to recover from trauma.
Well, first off, we don't have the evidence that it is. We just don't. There are not a lot of studies on required forgiveness in trauma recovery. There aren't. I would say there's maybe five or less. And those studies are significantly flawed, with sample sizes, with funding sources. There's a lot of flaws. So we don't have the evidence that suggests that. Now, if we do a ton of studies that shows that yes, trauma survivors need to forgive, I will concede. I will write a revised version of my book. I will do that. But we just don't have it. And also, in my personal experience, I haven't forgiven my parents,
Mhm.
but I do feel like I've made a ton of progress. Am I angry at them? No. Do I feel resentment? No.
Wow.
Do I feel empathy for them? No. Do I love or like them? No. What does that mean? To me, that's a little bit more acceptance.
Uh-huh.
I don't feel
Yeah.
like I've forgiven, but I've made progress. And I've seen so many trauma survivors come out on the other end of recovery with this established sense of safety and self-worth and confidence and just really thriving, and they never forgave.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how can you explain that? They're living these wonderful lives and yet they didn't forgive. Did they miss out on something? I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, before people start judging you, I think they need to read your book to understand your family history.
Right,
You just
right.
shared a lot right now about your parents. So I don't want people to think, oh, who is this woman, Amanda? But please read the book because you weave it in so carefully. So I thought it was really helpful of how you approach your family, the history of your great grandparents, etc., and even what happens in the womb. So I just want people to understand there is context to your statements right now because it was kind of
Yes.
just thrown out there. And if you read the book, you'll understand. But if you haven't, please do read Amanda's book because it's such a helpful way of understanding what forgiveness and trauma is as you weave your own experiences with your family, the family of origin. So I thought that was really helpful. Um, I thought when you included Everett Worthington Jr.'s model, the REACH model of forgiveness, I thought that was really helpful. So if you can just share a little bit what that is. So you use the acronym is REACH, REACH.
Right. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it
Well, it's
stands
recall,
for.
empathize, give, comment, commit, and hold. I know sometimes I can't remember anything on my own writing too. So
And
sorry
the
to
re-
throw that out, but I just thought it was really helpful. So recall the hurt, empathize with the one who hurt you, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, commit to the forgiveness you experience, and hold on to the forgiveness. I just thought that was a helpful kind of way to view forgiveness.
And that could be a wonderful model to use on your own in
Oh, yeah.
self-help, without a therapist. And so the one thing I like about that model is that the steps are pretty straightforward. All the materials are free. You can find it online. You can
Yeah.
bring it into therapy. Therapists can bring it into therapy. So it's very obtainable. And again, as long as we're practicing it safely and forgiveness is elective, so we get to, choose if we're going to forgive or if we're going to be open to that experience or not. It could be a helpful model.
Yeah. So thank you for including it. I think for readers, it'll be very helpful for those who are kind of seeking how we do engage in this forgiveness. Another section in the book that I found so helpful was when you brought in different religious perspective on forgiveness. I thought that was really helpful. You brought in Buddhism, you brought in Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism. So if you can just share a little bit, just like a snapshot of it, and I hope readers will go buy your book and read it more carefully, but just say a little bit because I thought bringing in the different religious perspective was really, really helpful.
Yes. And with this part, I really defer to the people who know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I allowed, rabbis, pastors, to really and researchers to really kind of come in and talk about forgiveness and the diversity of it. Honestly, that caught me off guard
Yeah.
because I kind of went in there assuming that I maybe kind of knew, what each person was going to say, but I didn't. And what I got so much out of it and loved is even saying that, look, if you are a trauma survivor and you adhere to a certain religion, you know, people shouldn't assume what you believe or don't believe or what you're bringing into the table or you're not, because even within those religions, it's so diverse.
Uh-huh.
There's so many different belief systems. And that's one thing that's in there that really kind of got across to me. And for as a clinician, it really validated my need to be curious, to not assume. If I have somebody who's Buddhist coming in, to not to assume that, oh, they're never been pressured to forgive, they're fine. Or someone who's Christian coming in, oh, they've been pressured to forgive their whole life. I can't assume that
Uh-huh.
because that's not always accurate. So it was great to bring all that. And I particularly love Islam being able to come in and talk about forgiveness because I didn't know anything about that. So that was so eye-opening for me and such wonderful to include that.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that in that section. Another part that was really helpful was because I do liberation theology, I work on a lot of social justice issues, either in my teaching ministry or in my writing. So you included this forgiveness and social justice. And the one quote that kind of stuck out in your book is Black people are expected to forgive so that white people can sleep at night. So tell us a bit more about this racism and social justice and forgiveness, because that quote just stuck out and it's gonna be with me for a while.
And that was said by one of my clients. And it just, yeah, it really just encapsulated her experience as a Black woman. And that was probably the hardest chapter for me to write, to be honest, even when I'm looking at my own stuff, because it was very much one of those chapters where I felt just kind of powerless, and I was reporting these things that were uncomfortable for me to read and report about. But I think that was good for me to really face that and include it. And, if we really look at the data, we do find that, Black people are encouraged to forgive more a lot of times than whites. And a philosopher, Dr. Maisha Cherry, sort of looked back at all of the incidents in which Black families whose children were murdered by a white offender,
Yeah,
they were asked to forgive
yeah,
publicly,
yeah.
not just publicly in front of everybody, but when the tables were turned. So when it was a white family whose child was murdered by a Black person, they were not asked to forgive. And so that's very interesting of why. And it usually is because we don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations. So it's again, forgiveness needs to be this sort of quick fix or this way around or a way to cool the anger. And unfortunately, forgiveness has been used as a weapon to maintain social injustices. And, if we don't just look at that and accept that and are aware of that, then we will continue to do it. We'll continue to perpetuate that pattern.
Yeah. So I'm just grateful for that section. And it's, looking at systemic racism and, how that, it refers to the policies and practices within the system. So you brought in, these social justice issues, and then you also brought in gender justice issues. So I really appreciated that. I co-wrote a book Surviving God, which deals with sexual violence, particularly against women in the church and how the church responds. And, the church is really quick to say, oh, forgive the perpetrator, who are usually the men or the male leaders, the elders, or the ministers or the priests. So here, you did bring in the experience of sexual assault and domestic violence. So if you want to say a little bit about that and tie that in with this forgiveness.
Right. And so, women typically from very young are encouraged to forgive a lot more than boys. And if you look at the research of trauma survivors and forgiveness, it is overwhelmingly women.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. I
Uh-huh.
would love to see those studies done with only men to see what the outcomes are and to see if, well, do men need to forgive now? Because I think sometimes the answer is no, men need justice. Well, don't women need justice? Well, what about justice and forgiveness? Can we have both? And so, yes, I think it is an issue because we have to push back against the good girl, mentality, or good women forgive, bad women don't. And that's just not true. And I think it's really tough because we look at, is there justice, with forgiveness or without? Do some people need justice first? What if justice doesn't come? A lot of times it does not. So then what do I do with that if I'm not going to get justice? Will I forgive? Will I not? And I think it's a whole lot easier when people don't feel like they are being forced to or pressure to. What if we just let people be angry? What if it's not a safety issue? They're safe. They're not going to harm themselves or anybody else. But can we sit with them in that anger? And can we say, yeah, you have every right to feel this way and you're not getting any justice, so you're even angrier? What would that be like? I think people are very afraid of the anger of women,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
because what will happen? If we get too angry, will something change the status quo? So these are just things that are important to note. And I did have an option not to include social justice in this book at all. And frankly, it would have been easier to
Uh-huh.
write it, but it just didn't feel right. Because if we're talking about forgiveness and trauma recovery, there are certain things that we can't sidestep, and social justice is one of them.
No, I'm so grateful that you included it. For me, that was so important that you kind of bring it into the society and society as a larger whole where there is so much trauma experienced by Black people and people of color and by women. And, it's not just out in society, but also in the churches and in faith communities across the different world religions. So I thought your book, you brought in your personal, you brought in all this research, and then the social justice aspect and world religion. I thought it was like a fabulous book. I'm so grateful that I got a chance to read it and to even have this conversation with you. So thank you so much for writing this book. You don't need to forgive.
Oh my gosh, you're so welcome. And I wanted it to be a one-stop shop. Like
Okay,
I'll just get
yeah.
this one for this other perspective. I won't have to get like five other books.
It is a one-stop shop. It was really good, but I'm just curious, are you working on anything new these days? Are you gonna write another book, maybe on a different topic or a follow-up?
You're actually the first person publicly to ask me that. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
really?
Yes. So I am just wrapping up the promotion for this one. So that's going to give me a little bit more space to research and no promises, but I do have an idea of
Okay.
writing a book about family estrangement from the point of view of trauma survivors and what they need, what they don't need, the stigma that comes with that. There's been a few books out recently that address that from a very different way. And so that's sort of another thing that I'm interested in. You can kind of see the tie with that and
Yeah. Oh, well,
forgiveness.
I think you should because it's the family trauma that you share so courageously here. That's not always easy for anyone to share. And then, especially as an Asian, where there's honor shame, you're not supposed to bring any shame to your family, the family history, the lineage. And you were so courageous. These types of trauma and pain happens in so many families of origin or you marry into. So I was really grateful for you to be able to weave that. And I look forward to that next book that you will be hopefully being able to write. I know you're so busy with your own practice and other family life and etc. But I really look forward to that one.
I'll have to send you a copy.
Yes, you must. So thank you so much, Amanda Ann Gregory, for coming on Madang Podcast to share your new book, You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms, published by Broadleaf Books. It's an excellent book for anyone kind of just interested in forgiveness or any trauma survivors or victims of trauma or victims of other things where we are told that we need to forgive. That's like your first step to recovery. We're told that, especially as Christians. So I just found your book really eye-opening and so enlightening. So thank you so much for coming on Madang Podcast, hosted by Christian Century, to share your important book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Please join me and Dr. Tripp Fuller for Homebrew Christianity's 4-week online class, Rediscovering the Spirit, Hand Raisers, Han, and the Holy Ghost. This course will explore the dynamic, often overlooked third person of the Trinity. Course will cover the Spirit in Scripture and early Christianity, historical developments and theological tensions, feminist and global perspectives on the Spirit, and living in the Spirit today. Please go to www.homebrewchristianity.com and register today. Please join Tripp Fuller and me at Holy Trinity Lutheran, Chapel Hill Church for a live Homebrew Christianity podcast and book signing on June 8th at 7 p.m. This is free and open to the public. Please meet us there. Colonized and appropriated by capitalism, dominant culture, fitness trends, and body shaming, yoga in America is associated with expensive classes, trendy athleisure products, core power, Lululemon, and white women. However, yoga is not a 1-hour fitness class aimed at stretching and flexibility. Yoga is a spiritual practice from South Asia with the ultimate goal of connection, self-realization, and liberation. In Liberating Yoga, a new book from Broadleaf Books, yoga teacher Harpinder Kaur Mann draws from her own perspective as a Sikh Punjabi woman who was alienated by the way yoga is practiced in the United States, but found her way toward reclaiming the spiritual practice for herself. Mann demonstrates that moving away from appropriated forms of yoga and back to yoga roots is a true path to healing, both for yoga practitioners who desire to engage responsibly in the practice with cultural appreciation, and especially for folks who have been marginalized who wish to reconnect with their ancestral spiritual practices and reclaim their full identity. Please read Liberating Yoga.
For sponsorship inquiries, please email madangpodcast.gmail.com.